All right, so you guys send in some really interesting stuff this week, but there's this one research paper about the yield curve that is a real head-scratcher.
Yeah, it really is.
I mean, everyone's heard of it.
Right.
This economic indicator with its almost spooky ability to predict recessions.
Like a crystal ball.
But here's the thing.
What's that?
Even with this so-called crystal ball, economists are still pretty bad at actually calling those recessions.
Oh, so it's not perfect.
So that's what we're diving deep into today.
Sounds good.
Why are they so bad at this?
You know what I think is really interesting about this paper?
Yeah.
It actually goes beyond just the yield curve itself.
Oh, really?
It brings in this data from something called the Survey of Professional Forecasters, or SPF.
SPF, okay.
Basically, it's this group of economists who regularly give their predictions about...
Economy.
Exactly, the economy.
Okay, so they're basically putting these expert predictions
Head to head.
against a simple model based on the yield spread.
Yep.
Now, for those who need a quick reminder, that's the difference between
long term
and
short term.
short-term interest rates.
You got it.
Okay, got it.
And the results are pretty surprising.
Okay.
The SPF forecasts are okay in the short term,
Right.
but when it comes to predicting recessions 3 or 4 quarters out,
Oh.
that simple yield spread model I was talking about,
Yeah.
it totally blows them out of the water.
So wait, these economists have all this fancy data.
Tons of it.
They have all these complex models.
Yeah.
And they're being outsmarted by
Basics.
a basic yield spread calculation.
Yeah, pretty much. I know.
I mean, why even bother with the SPF at that point
Right.
if it's so inaccurate?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
That is the question.
And if you're fascinated by these kinds of economic mysteries,
Oh, I am.
you got to be subscribed to the Book Summary Podcast channel.
Of course.
All right, back to the show.
So let's get back to this show. I mean, I love a good puzzle.
Who doesn't?
And this one has me absolutely hooked. So
Okay.
what are some of the theories that the paper throws out there
Okay, so
to explain this discrepancy?
one of the possibilities is that economists have been kind of underestimating the impact of their own actions.
Ooh, interesting.
So things like interest rate hikes or cuts.
Which are reflected in the yield curve.
Exactly. They seem to have a much bigger effect on the economy than they initially thought.
So it's like they forgot they were holding the steering wheel.
Kind of, yeah.
I mean, seriously.
It's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, if the yield curve is essentially reflecting their own monetary policy decisions, shouldn't they be the best at interpreting it?
Logically, you'd think so, right?
Right.
But the research seems to suggest that there's a little more to it than that.
Okay, so how did they figure this out?
Well, the paper goes into how they tested this.
Yeah.
And it's actually really clever.
Okay, lay it on me.
They recreated the forecasting environment as it would existed in real time.
Wait, hold on. Are we talking about time travel here?
No time travel.
Okay.
It's more like
Okay.
they pretended they were making these predictions in the past using only the data that was available at that specific time.
Oh, that's interesting.
So for each quarter,
Yeah.
they would re-estimate their yield spread model using this limited data set.
So they're basically
Taking away...
taking away hindsight bias,
Right.
putting themselves in the shoes of those economists back then.
Exactly.
That's pretty ingenious.
It is.
So what happened?
Well, even with this real-time approach,
Yeah?
the yield spread model still consistently outperforms the expert predictions from the SPF,
Wow.
especially for those longer-term forecasts.
It's like they had the answer key,
I know.
but decided to just guess instead.
It's really strange.
Okay, I am even more intrigued now.
Good.
But before we jump into why this predictive power seems to just stick around,
Okay.
you're an expert in this stuff.
I dabble.
Does anything in this paper really jump out at you
That's a good question.
as particularly surprising?
You know what? Honestly, what surprised me the most was how they define a recession.
Oh, okay. How so?
They use a very specific definition.
Yeah.
Instead of the typical 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth.
Right. The one you always hear.
Yeah, the one you always hear in the news.
Right.
They define it as a single quarter of negative real GDP growth.
Really?
Yeah.
That seems
Yeah.
overly simplistic. I mean, you think a single bad quarter
I know.
wouldn't be enough to call a full-blown recession?
I thought so too at first.
Yeah.
But they found that this definition is actually really effective.
Oh.
It lines up incredibly well with the official recessions declared by the National Bureau of Economic Research.
The NBER.
Yeah, those are the folks who actually decide when a recession begins and ends.
So they're using a simpler definition,
Much simpler.
but it's shockingly accurate.
Surprisingly, yes.
This whole yield curve thing is just full of surprises.
It really is.
All right, before we get into why this predictive power seems to endure, I need to remind our listeners, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the wild world of economics,
Yes, please
you
do.
got to hit that like button.
Yes.
Subscribe to the Book Summary Podcast channel for more insightful explorations just like this one.
We appreciate it.
We're unpacking all sorts of fascinating research.
Really interesting stuff.
And trust me, you won't want to miss it.
You really don't. You know, it's almost like there's this blind spot when
Yeah.
it comes to the yield curve.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like the paper talks about how even after all this research came out
Yeah.
in the late 1980s,
Okay.
showing how reliable this yield spread is, forecasters still didn't seem to fully grasp its importance.
So they had the information.
They had it.
They knew the yield spread was a valuable tool,
They knew.
and yet
And yet.
they didn't use it.
Yeah, it's kind of.
That seems almost willfully ignorant.
It really does make you wonder
It does.
why.
Yeah, why?
So the paper suggests a few possible explanations.
Okay, I'm listening.
One is that maybe economists were just too focused on other economic indicators.
They're looking at too many things.
Yeah, they're looking at so many different data points that the signal from the yield curve might have just gotten lost in the noise.
Okay, I can see how that could happen.
Right.
It's like trying to hear a whisper
Exactly.
in a crowded room.
It's too much going on.
Yeah.
And plus, you got to remember, this was before we had the kind of computing power and data analysis techniques that we have today.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, back then.
It was a lot harder to sift through all that economic data.
Yeah, and find those meaningful signals.
Exactly.
But still, you'd think
You'd think.
the yield curve's track record would speak for itself.
Right, especially after all that research
Yeah.
that confirmed its predictive power.
It seems like a pretty strong case.
You would think so.
Yeah.
But, you know, human psychology,
Oh, here we go.
it's a funny thing.
I know it is.
The paper actually points out that there's this tendency for us to just dismiss warnings when things seem unique or special.
Oh, you mean like the whole this time is different mentality?
Exactly.
We as humans love to believe that the old rules don't apply to us
We do it all the time.
all the time.
And in economics,
Yeah.
there's always this temptation to explain away potential warning signs.
Okay. How so?
Well, maybe there's a new technology on the horizon
Uh-huh.
or a political shift.
That promises to change everything.
Right. And it's easy to get caught up in those narratives
Yeah.
and just convince yourself that the yield curve's no longer relevant.
So we're basically our own worst enemies
Sometimes, yeah.
when it comes to economic forecasting.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah. It's a little disheartening.
It is a little bit.
Yeah.
But we have this powerful tool
Mhm.
that has been shown to be remarkably accurate,
Yeah.
but we keep finding reasons to ignore it.
We do.
And actually, the paper suggests
Yeah.
that this might be one of the reasons
Mm.
why the yield curve's predictive power has persisted for so long.
Now, that is fascinating because
It is.
if we were consistently heeding its warnings,
Right.
wouldn't that eventually change the dynamics of the economy
Mm-hmm.
and make the yield curve less accurate?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
It's possible that by dismissing the yield curve, we're actually inadvertently perpetuating its predictive power.
It's like,
We're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
yeah, a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
I know.
My mind is officially blown.
Mine too.
So what does this all mean
Okay.
for us regular folks
Right.
who aren't economists?
Yeah, good question.
Should we all be glued to the yield curve,
Hmm.
waiting for the next recession signal?
Well, I wouldn't recommend becoming obsessed with it,
Okay.
but I do think there are some valuable lessons we can take away
Okay, like
from this research.
give us some actionable insights here.
Okay, first, I think it's a good reminder to be humble.
Okay, I like that.
Even the smartest people in the room can get things wrong,
That's very true.
especially when it comes to something as complex as the economy.
Yeah, for sure.
Second, we should always be questioning our assumptions.
Okay.
Just because something worked in the past doesn't mean it'll always work in the future.
Okay, those are really good points.
Yeah,
Don't be overconfident
right.
and always be willing to adapt.
Exactly.
Okay.
And finally, I think it's important to remember that no single indicator,
Uh-huh.
not even the yield curve, can tell us everything we need to know about the future.
That's true.
The economy is a constantly evolving system,
Mm-hmm.
and there are always going to be unpredictable factors at play.
So don't put all your eggs in one basket
Right.
and stay informed
Yes.
about what's happening in the world.
Exactly.
Okay, Before we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
anything else about this research that particularly struck you?
You know, I was really intrigued by the way they went about analyzing the data.
Oh, how so?
They didn't just look at the raw numbers and call it a day.
Okay.
They actually recreated the forecasting environment. Uh-huh.
As it would have existed in real time,
Right.
using only the information
Yeah.
that was available at the time each forecast was made.
So they were really trying to put themselves in the shoes
Yes.
of those economists.
Exactly.
Trying to make predictions without the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah, it's like stepping back in time and seeing how the yield spread model would have performed
Interesting.
if you were actually using it to make real-world decisions.
So what did they find?
Well, what's really impressive
Yeah.
is that even with this limited data,
Okay.
the model still holds up remarkably well.
That's pretty convincing evidence.
I think so.
Yeah.
For the power of the yield curve.
If it can outperform the experts,
Yes.
even when you take away hindsight,
Mm-hmm.
you know there's something special about it.
There is.
Yeah.
It's not a magic bullet,
Right.
but it's definitely a tool worth paying attention to.
Well said. And for our listeners who are finding this as fascinating as we are,
Yes.
don't forget to hit that like button.
And subscribe to the Book Summary Podcast channel
We appreciate it.
for more deep dives
Yes.
into the world of research and knowledge.
That's what we do.
Now let's get into this final section of the research,
Right.
where they delve into why this predictive power of the yield curve
Mm-hmm.
has endured over time,
Okay.
even when economists are aware of it.
This is where things get really interesting.
Okay. Before we get into that, a quick reminder for our listeners.
Yes.
Hit that like button
Bleh.
and subscribe to the Book Summary Podcast channel for more deep dives into the world of knowledge and research.
We'd love to have you.
Okay, so we've talked about how the yield curve is this surprisingly strong predictor of recessions,
Right.
and how even when economists know about it,
Yeah.
they don't always use that knowledge very well.
That's right.
So the big question is,
What is it?
why does this predictive power endure?
Yeah. It's a real head scratcher.
It's like having a cheat sheet
Right.
and still failing the test.
Yeah. I know. And that's the part of this paper that really got me thinking.
Yeah.
It's one thing to say, yeah, the yield curve has a good track record.
Yeah.
But it's another thing entirely to actually use that information consistently.
In the real world.
Exactly. In your forecasts and decisions.
And especially when you think about the fact that the more people pay attention to a signal like this,
Yeah.
the more likely it is to actually lose its predictive power.
Right. It's almost like a self-defeating prophecy.
Yeah, you'd think if everyone started panicking every time the yield curve inverted,
Uh-huh.
the markets would adjust
Mm.
and the signal would become less reliable.
You'd think so.
So the fact that it's remained so persistent
Right.
kind of suggests that
Yeah.
maybe there's something more fundamental going on here.
Yeah, I think so too.
So what are some of the explanations that the researchers offer?
Well, they explore a few possibilities. And one that I thought was really interesting is the idea that maybe economists have been underestimating the impact of monetary policy on the economy.
Oh, so going back to what we were talking about before.
Yeah, exactly. Remember we talked about how the yield curve is influenced by things like...
Interest rate hikes and cuts.
Right, exactly. Those kinds of things.
So it's basically reflecting the actions of central banks.
Right. It's like a mirror in a way.
So if economists were underestimating the impact of those actions, they might also be underestimating the importance of this signal.
Yeah. They're looking at the symptom, but not really understanding the underlying cause.
Yeah, it's like seeing the smoke,
Yeah.
but not realizing there's a fire.
A fire somewhere. Yeah.
Exactly. So what are some of the other possible explanations?
Well, another possibility is that
Yeah.
the real world is just too complex.
It's messy.
It's messy. Yeah, it's way too complex to capture fully in any model,
No matter how sophisticated.
no matter how much data you have.
Yeah, there are always going to be those unpredictable events. Unexpected shifts in consumer behavior.
Right.
Geopolitical shocks.
Yeah, things that you just can't account for.
Things that just come out of nowhere.
Yeah, no model can perfectly predict those kinds of things.
They're trying to predict the weather.
It is.
You can have all the data in the world,
all the fancy technology.
but there's always a chance of a freak storm.
Exactly. You just never know.
And of course,
Who knows?
you can't forget the human element.
Oh, the human element.
The paper talks about how we have this tendency
We do.
to downplay warnings when we think this time is different,
Oh, that's classic.
or when we have other reasons to be optimistic.
It's just human nature.
We always want to believe
We do.
that the good times will last.
Right. Even when the evidence suggests otherwise.
Yeah, it's like we're wearing rose-colored glasses.
Sometimes, yeah.
And especially in economics,
Right.
there's always that temptation
Always.
to rationalize away potential problems.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there's a new technology that's going to revolutionize everything.
So, or a political leader who promises...
Unprecedented growth.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in those stories and ignore the warning signs.
We do it all the time.
So it's a combination of factors.
Yeah.
Underestimating the impact of policy,
Right.
the inherent complexity of the economy, and
Our own biases.
our own psychological biases.
Exactly.
We're a mess.
We are.
So the researchers argue that all of these factors contribute to the enduring power of the yield curve.
That's right.
We keep expecting it to stop working,
Yeah.
but it keeps proving us wrong.
Time and time again.
So what's the takeaway here for our listeners?
What should they do?
Should we all be obsessively checking the yield spread
I don't think so.
and panicking
Not necessarily.
every time it inverts?
No.
Yeah.
I think the main message here is humility.
Humility.
Yeah, we need to recognize that even the experts can be wrong.
They're not always right.
No, they're not.
And no single indicator can tell us everything
Right.
we need to know about the future.
Yeah. It's important to stay informed.
Stay informed.
Question your assumptions.
Don't be overconfident.
Exactly, and be prepared for the unexpected.
The unexpected is always lurking around the corner.
It is.
Well said. And on that note, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question.
Ooh, I like it.
Does the enduring power of the yield curve suggest that recessions are inherently more predictable
Okay.
than we give them credit for?
Interesting.
Or does it point to our own limitations in interpreting economic signals
Hmm.
and our tendency to repeat the same mistakes over and over again?
That's a great question.
That's a question to ponder.
It is.
And for our listeners who want to delve even deeper into this topic,
Yeah.
be sure to check out the full research paper.
Yes.
The link is in the show notes.
As always,
And of course, don't forget to like, subscribe,
like, subscribe.
and hit that notification bell
Yeah.
for more insightful deep dives on the Book Summary Podcast.
We appreciate you being here.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's fun.
Until next time, keep those minds curious.
Stay curious out there.